Good afternoon, good evening, good morning if you're watching this tomorrow or you're someplace on the other side of the world. Hey folks, thanks for showing up to my live stream tonight. This is Neurofeedback and Chill, which is our weekly live stream talking about biohacking topics and doing a little bit of neurofeedback typically. Tonight we are talking about the immune system and how we might be able to modulate it using different sorts of biofeedback, neurofeedback, and I have a couple papers to talk about that include some mindfulness. So I thought I would give you a little bit of a quick survey of some of the most interesting things that are popping out in ways to modify and improve immune response using some of these biofeedback and neurofeedback topics. So hello folks. Hey Radar Ashwood, nice to see you today. I see a few other folks are rolling in. Hello everyone. Hope you guys are doing well. If you're new to Neurofeedback and Chill, again, it's a weekly live stream. I will typically set myself up with a neurofeedback session and describe the mechanics of it to give you some perspective about neurofeedback. And I'll often pick a neurofeedback protocol that has some relevance to a topic and then dig into the topic in terms of cortical impact. And tonight I'm talking about the immune system, which has a lot of intriguing stuff showing up in the literature over the past 30, 40 years, but it's not enough papers. You know, I sort of was writing out a literature review and realized that while there's a handful of compelling papers, the metadata studies really underscore the idea that we aren't quite there in terms of the effect sizes. So I wanted to include some individual papers and show you some of what is being seen, but you're going to have to sort of navigate yourself for building protocols and developing neurofeedback practices around this, because I think we're still a little bit more in the wild west of immune modification compared to something like ADHD, where we have a lot of control in some ways over the brain. So hey, El Chatterino, nice to see you. How you doing tonight? What is this I have on the edge of it's wires. Okay, let me change my monitor. Boop, there we go. Okay, so hopefully you guys are doing well tonight. You training your brains? Got some neurofeedback going? Move over here a little bit. Cool. All right, so I think tonight I'm going to do an alpha session at PZ followed by an SMR session at C4. To turn off the title. And let's get going here with a session. So let me go set up my eager session, or at least plan it. Let me actually drag my head off to one side so you can see what I'm doing. So you can ignore the fact that I'm looking away right now. And we've got a head up here. And so PZ minus A1 is the first montage, the first placement of wires in the head. We're going to measure 4 to 7. And an alpha, 6.75 to 9.75. So just below 7 and 10 hertz, which is low alpha or alpha 1. I'll explain in a minute why I chose that. And then I have a high beta, 20 to 32, that I'm going to inhibit. And I'll explain what I mean by reward and inhibit in a second. And I'll do that for just 9 minutes, and then I'll follow that up with another protocol at the vertex of my head, CZ, and that is an SMR protocol, which we'll do at 4 to 7, 11.5 hertz reward, and a 20 to 32 inhibit as well, and also for 9 minutes. So there's my protocol set up. So let me go back and answer questions while I'm setting up wires and say hello to people. Radar has a question. Radar is asking, how about any anecdotes of clients? Ever found that a client's autoimmune disease slowed down its progression after neurofeedback? I do actually have a story for you, Radar. There was a client I was working with who had some autoimmune stuff, and I was working with him not for his immune system, but for a mix of alcohol and creativity. He was having a really hard time not drinking and wouldn't fall asleep unless he drank for years. And so he came in and we did some work, a lot of alpha theta, a lot of SMR. And right at the end of a 2-month period, he'd done about 30 sessions, about half and half with alpha theta for relaxation work and SMR training. And right at the end of his 2 months, a colleague of mine, Dr. Gary Schumer, published a paper showing that T cells could be raised with neurofeedback. I'll talk about that paper tonight. And this client of mine was immunocompromised. And I said, interesting, here's this new paper, client. And he went out and got a blood test and looked at T cells. And his T cells were really quite low, about 20% of where they should be a couple months prior. And they were about 120% of typical at that point, right after the alpha training. And so I'll talk about Gary Schumer's work, but doing a very similar type of protocol, we got very similar effects, which is a really noticeable T cell effect in an individual. And I've been using a variant of that same protocol for all sorts of immune support, especially over the past several years, both chronic immune issues, as well as in helping people, I think, recover a little faster from COVID and the flu and other immune challenges. So I think there are lots of protocols that can work on the immune system. You'll find that in the literature, it's often alpha training at parietal and occipital sites, or it's SMR training, and you'll see some alpha theta training used for immune as well. But I'll get into the papers a little bit and how we do see a few papers that are multimodal, really seeing the most impact. And I'll get into why I think that is in a second. And then at the end of the talk today, I sort of have 4 takeaways about the status and the state of the literature, the immune system research. So if you're watching this live, hang out to the end of the hour. But if you are watching this later on, you can skip to the end if you want to get some of the takeaways. So how's that for an anecdote, Radar? Is that okay? There's lots of them. I've had people... Lots of people try immune protocols and notice a subjective effect. I've only had a few people actually do blood tests, but we've seen it whenever people have looked. They've seen an immune response. So that's my own personal experience with clients, but you'll discover that there's pretty robust individual level research, but there's not enough studies. There's the threshold for trusting studies that are showing impact should be really around 50, I think. And if we had more than 50 studies, would be able to estimate really the quality and size of all the studies. But there's only about a dozen good studies out there, and they're all somewhat small. I'll talk about a couple of them tonight. And even though they have small n's and modest effect sizes, the effects they do get are compelling. And a couple of them have really strong effects as well. All right, so I got 2 ear clips out, and then let me grab one flat wire at a time. There's one. Let me put the rest of the wires away so my cats don't insist on playing with them. Yeah, I'm talking about you. Somebody's eyeing this wire very carefully and hoping I put it down. She's just too lazy to get up and grab it right now. Okay, put this up here. And... actually, it's a blue one instead of 2 black ones. That's better. It's better when you're putting 2 ear clips on to not have the same wire color because it's just too easy to get confused. And you don't want to have to follow the wires down from your own head. It's much easier to look down and see what colors you have going on. So thanks, Radar. You like that story? Appreciate it. All right, so let me put on some ear clips. This is going to be a PZ minus A1 followed by a CZ minus A1. So I'm going to use a clip on my left ear, that's A1, auricular 1, and that'll remain my reference the whole time. I like to hang the wires with the wire side outside the ear to avoid any brushing against the neck if possible. Yeah, Radar has a comment that's quite astute. Sounds like since he was an alcoholic that his EEG was low voltage fast. It was. It was very fast. It was somewhat low voltage, not as much as you might think, but he had 0 production of delta. Basically, he actually made alpha, but no delta. And then after a couple of months, he was making pretty good delta. Still not great, but a bit better. And then his alpha production came up nicely. And that was really what made the difference, I think, in his anxiety and his immune system. Pretty sure it was the alpha based on what the literature has shown. All right, so another ear clip here. This one's got a blue wire. I'm going to hang this off my right ear. And since my reference, the second term is in the left, then this becomes the ground. You always need a ground wire in most of the amps we use in the commercial space. And so it's important to put it someplace convenient, like an extra ear. All right, so blue, right ear is the ground. On this little amplifier, the middle socket, the green socket is the ground. And then red minus black is the channel. So the minus or the reference goes into the second hole, i.e. the black. And then I'll put one on my head at PZ. So PZ is P for parietal, Z for the zenith, down the midline of the head. And basically your PZ is the back midline over the middle of a flat spot if you have one. And in theory, it's over the posterior cingulate, which is one of the big cortical generators of alpha, especially the alpha involved with sort of setting the overall speed of the alpha throughout the whole brain. So I just put a little dab of paste, put it right in the middle by touch. I'll switch to the vertex in my head and use the camera later. And this last wire goes into the red socket. So now, so you can see the pinouts. There's the wire setup for you. So how many folks here have tried alpha training or alpha theta training? And what is your experience with it? Because a lot of the immune work in the literature is some variant of alpha or alpha theta. So I'm curious who here has tried it and or if you've ever tried these things for immune system support. All right, my amp is plugged in. I have wires in my head. Let me move my talking head over a little bit. Gonna find that mouse. There we go. All right. Put me off to the side. Cool. All right. So now let me get the session going. I'm gonna hit run. And I'm picking a pretty basic game. I keep threatening to install all the really cool games and show you guys those things. If you want me to show you Zucor's Air, Zucor's Drive, Zucor's Grind, Zucor's Carnival, the Ardea games, including Lotus Pond, Potions, Postcards, let me know because I have them all. I just have to install them and then you guys can see them. They're mostly add-ons, although if you're a Peak Brain client, then the Ardea games, Postcards, Potions, and Postcard Potions and there's a koi pond whose name escapes me. That's one of them as well. Maybe it's called Fish Pond or something. All right, selecting this one, we're going to go after, let's go after just basic box lights. We'll get super old school today. So you can see that there's boxes in the screen. Well, there will be in a second. They were there for a minute, and then they vanished. All right, so let me scale up. We have a signal that's pretty noisy, actually. You can see how that's got to be, something's wrong with my signal quality. Let's see why. Is it my ear clip? It's not tight enough on this side. That's what it was. You can see how the signal got a whole lot cleaner all at once. So I could tell just because I'm used to looking at signals that there was something weird in the quality of that signal. And it wasn't coming from my brain. It was some noise from the environment. And once I squeeze down the ground wire, you can see that it's able to reject the noise from the environment. And now we're getting clean brain waves showing up. Radar saying he just trained FC minus PZ, rewarding 7 to 10. Cool. And hitting 4 to 7 and 20 to 32 yesterday. That's a great protocol. I love the FC minus PZ. I think I started to teach people to use that about 20 years ago. I don't know anyone who used it before me, although I'm sure people did. Radar's used alpha theta a few times. Do you enjoy alpha theta? PNQ, hello PNQ. I think that felt more like an immune anecdote, more so than autoimmune, but still super cool. Oh, were you hoping for an autoimmune example? I can give you those, although those are a little more subtle. I can give you more general ideas on autoimmune, PNQ. If you want some explanation of that, just let me know. I'll unpack that a touch for you. El Chatarino says he sees traces of those boxes when he closes his eyes. Too many days watching jump box and box lights. So I'm going to scale. It's F9. There we go. That's fine. Then F11. Oh, that's F12. F11. Shift F10 to scale back down. F9. There we go. sure what happened there. Close that. Okay, and I'm going to hit F5 to begin. So function F5. Cool. So now what's happening is the blue box is my amount of alpha, this 6.75 band I have here. This is my alpha waves. And you can see that the amount of alpha is about 15 microvolts. And I want the alpha to go up. So what I'm doing is I've set a threshold just below it. You can see it's highlighted 11.5. And as long as I keep my alpha high, meaning I keep the alpha above that, now it says 13, then I'm going to have beeps happen and the game will sort of run smoothly. If my alpha dips, if it goes down below the 13.5 number, that'll stop the feedback. That's biofeedback. And the opposite's true of the 4 to 7 band and the 20 to 32 band. Those have to stay below their threshold number. And you'll see that about every 30 seconds, just happened now, the thresholds change. So every 30 seconds or so, the thresholds will adjust next to where the brain is and wait for the brain to flex a little bit on its own in the right direction. And then the beeps and the movement happen in response to the brain flexing. So it's really an involuntary process of exercising your brain, and you can do it with very simple animations or games like this. I'm not sure you can hear the beeps happening, but the idea is that my brain is noticing the pattern of beeps, and the pattern only occurs when the alpha is going up and the betas and thetas are going down. So that's biofeedback. Very basic theory, but it does produce different effects based on where in the head you train, what you train for frequencies, and what brain you're starting off with as well. Some more questions. Let's see. El Chatarino sees these boxes when he closes his eyes. Too many months working there. El Chatarino says FC minus PZ coherence or poor man style isn't common. Yeah, the bipolar pair to break up coherence is uncommon. It was dropped a lot once a lot of the software packages started to have coherence in the software algorithms. And a lot of people stopped using bipolar difference pairs to reward to break up hypercoherence. It still works, and I still do it a fair amount. But it's not as common to do that sort of phenomena going after coherence specifically, I don't think. I mean, maybe it's taught that way in some courses, but I don't think it's a very common way to approach the brain. Radar Ashwood is saying alpha theta was relaxing, but no history of trauma. Yeah, alpha theta can be a trauma release protocol. It's not used that way so much anymore. It's used mostly for creativity, flow state, some immune work. You can do gentle work for relaxing. There's some mood support from it in general. So I'm already feeling this alpha. I'm a little bit like stumbling over my words because it's probably too slow an alpha for me. So let me go to the page. I'm going to raise the alpha by half a hertz, quarter hertz, just to 7 to 10. Because stumbling over my words means my speed of processing was starting to dip. And I'm sensitive enough to a quarter hertz adjustment that I'll probably notice a slight difference in a moment. PNQ says they tried it, but I think I went closer to OZ rather than PZ while trying to do at home. Oops. Yeah, you know, alpha theta actually works really well at OZ itself or at PZ. And I use a site called POZ often, which is between the two. And it works really well. The height of alpha theta is very forgiving. Z-line or midline alpha theta is not the same as moving off to one side though. So it's important to remain on the midline. But you can actually get away with everything from OZ down to or up to PZ without too much trouble. And you get different effects. If you're training at PZ, the effects are more emotional. The effects can have more anxiety relief. And if you're training down at OZ, you can get more visualization. And so in between, you can get a combination of stress reduction, creativity and flow, and visualization all at once. So POZ minus A1 is often a really nice place to do alpha theta. PNQ is asking, is PZ minus FC a bad idea if you have a little too much alpha at FZ? Yeah, rewarding alpha is a bad idea if you're already making alpha at FC minus PZ, yeah, or at FZ by itself. Front midline alpha is probably there with front midline theta as well. So look and see which it is for you, if it's one or both. But you got to be really cautious about rewarding slow brain waves in the frontal lobe. It does not work real well, and you should only line it up if you really need it. Now, you can get away with it if you have the anxiety need, so to speak, to reduce an anterior cingulate that's locked up, and you could do things where you did down training. That'd be the safest way. The safer way to go after it would be to leave a hole where the alpha is weak or not well regulated, and then tamp down things around it. So if your alpha, like from 7 to 13 is high, and you know that the 7 to 10 is probably healthy and the 10 to 13 is probably excessive, then you could down train theta, also down train 10 to 20, and then down train 20 to 32, leaving a hole, leaving a window in 7 to 10. This is often called the windowed squash, where you do a broad set of inhibits, leaving a range. And this works especially well for alpha. So, Radar Ashwood is asking, does it matter that that training with eyes open? Yes, a little bit. Now you can do PZ minus A1, either eyes open or eyes closed. You'd want to do significant alpha training eyes closed or alpha theta training eyes closed. In general, the rule of thumb is if you're rewarding below 10 hertz, then you can close the eyes and it's fine. This protocol would be a little stronger for me, this alpha training I'm doing right now, if my eyes were closed, although I'm feeling it. So it's definitely working. PNQ is saying, sorry, you meant PZ alpha, that there was a lot of tension in your body afterwards. Yeah, you probably have fast alpha at PZ then. You probably have alpha in the 10 to 13 range. There's probably no real need to do PZ minus A1 or alpha theta at PZ. Instead, you should do some SMR at CZ, maybe C4 minus PZ, and get the other thetas and betas under control first, and then go later into alpha theta. P&Q is agreeing you have some front midline theta and maybe some alpha. Yeah, those are things to work on first before you work on rewarding alpha. Hey, Ilya's asking, does alpha theta tend to have more or less of an emotional versus visual experience depending on training site? It does. So as you go up towards PZ, it's more emotional. As you go down towards OZ, it's more visual, and you can split the difference. PNQ is asking, how do you downtrain FZ theta? Because eye blinks also pick up as theta. Yeah, well, you can, in Eager, see this software here we're using right now, the top trace is not super visible. Let me scale it from 50 microvolts to 20, and that'll make it bigger. I'll show you in Eager how you would do it. You can create something like this in BioExplorer or other software, but it's really easy in Eager. Let's see, F9, and then minus to make it scale of 20. So I just scaled my raw signal down to 20 microvolts, and you can see it's a lot bigger. And if I'm going to blink a few times, now there's the wire is actually in the back of my head, so it's not going to be sensitive to blinks. But if I tap the wire, let's say, wait till the trace becomes visible again. Okay, here's the trace. Now I'll tap it. See, as I'm tapping it, it's actually exceeding the blue lines that surround it, and it actually drops the game away. The game vanishes. I get some high amplitude noise. Now, it's not quite as obvious when you're blinking, but the same thing should happen. Eager has artifact rejection thresholds to clip out signals that are high amplitude. And in most software, you can do something where you clip out the blinks. So that's the short answer, is you set it up so when the amplitude changes above 50 microvolts or something, you just stop giving any signal reward. And you set your software up to clip out the artifact ideally, which again is pretty easy to do in Eager, but not always easy to do in all software packages. Radar saying the windowed squash might cause problems if your beta isn't that high. Yeah, only if you have low amplitude EEG would it really cause trouble. PNQ is saying, but SMR might trigger mu. It shouldn't. It really shouldn't if you're doing proper SMR training. It would only really happen if you don't need SMR training or if you're training the wrong frequency of SMR, and then mu might come up. But mu is a good thing to have when you need it, so there's nothing wrong with training up mu. Radar Ashwood's asking, is rewarding alpha with eyes open dangerous in some ways, or is it just slightly less effective? Just the latter, just slightly less effective than eyes closed. Mostly because it's being made in eyes closed so much more strongly. There's less in the way of it. So let me change my protocol to the next protocol, function F4. Now it says CZ, which you probably can't see under my head. I'm going to move the wire. You can see the frequency change from 7 to 10 up to 11 and a half. My hunch is I can't see my screen. Let me see. Is that wire in the right place? It is probably... Need to move it off to the right a little bit. And also, there's not nearly enough paste on there. Actually, there might be. Yeah, that's good enough for the signal. Okay. So now I'm trading CZ minus A1. Wait for my signal to stabilize a minute. And then I will kick that off for 3 more segments. And I'm doing CZ, which is an SMR, because this is one of the protocols that in the literature seem to cause some immune response in some studies. Although, again, the literature is not the best here. So I didn't write an article up for you. I will at some point for this stuff. Okay, F5 to begin again. Cool. All right, let's talk a little bit, unless you have more questions. Let's see, there's a question. Ryan, hello, Ryan. What negative effects would you look for with alpha training that would indicate that it isn't the right thing to target? Adverse effects after it. So you would typically get a lot of calmness and then some rebound anxiety when the calmness wears off, if the alpha is not really meant to be trained for you. Also, it's not a problem, but you have to watch out for lighter sleep, especially sleep onset getting thrown off a little bit when you're doing lots of alpha training. And you can hedge and do alpha plus SMR like I'm doing now and usually eliminate that. Or you can just kind of watch for it. When it shows up, you can go back to doing SMR trainings or beta trainings for a couple of sessions, put your sleep back on track, and then go back into the alpha training. And also depending on the individual, you might want to do alpha training with a delta inhibit. Especially with brain fog, and that would potentially ameliorate some of the fatigue and rebound effects that you would get by pushing really hard. But generally, alpha theta training either works well, or you just kind of don't like it, and and you feel kind of foggy after it. So it doesn't usually cause big adverse effects, although people can be emotional right afterwards. You feel kind of stoned afterwards. So, all right, let me talk about some of the papers that I found for you today. There was 7 major studies that I think 5 of them had a strong neurofeedback tie-in, and a couple were similar, like mind-body things. And then there were a couple of metadata studies looking across several studies. The first study was done published in 1993 by Gruber et al., looking at breast cancer. And this is a multimodal study. It was only a few people. It was 13 people in a post-mastectomy trial. So these are people who were at risk for recurrent breast cancer and had double mastectomies. And they followed these 13 women for, it was a long time, for 18 months. It was an 18-month intervention study, which is really long for a sort of wellness style study. And they had them do a mix of biofeedback on muscle tension, sort of for stress, EMG, as well as relaxation training and imagery, guided imagery. So it's a mix of biofeedback and mindfulness, essentially. And they found that for these individuals, and even though it was a group of only 13, the natural killer T cell activity went up with a p-value of 0.017. The lymphocyte response increased with a p-value of 0.001, and the Con-A responsiveness to an antibody challenge was p of 0.001 as well. So the takeaway is that this multimodal biofeedback process seems to boost multiple immune markers in cancer patients. And since some cancers are immune sensitive, this is a really interesting finding. So I wanted to cover that, even though it wasn't strictly speaking neurofeedback, because it was biofeedback on EMG as well as mindfulness, which is sort of our next door neighbor when it comes to neurofeedback. And then we have a big study from 2003 published by Davidson looking at mindfulness and how well we respond to the flu vaccine. So you can measure, after giving somebody a vaccine, you can measure the amount of immune response they have to it. And this is something that will drop off with age. If you're young and healthy, you have a powerful response, a lot of antibodies produced, and then it drops off. If you're elderly, you have a weaker response, and it's a shorter length of time as well. So you can use the response to a vaccine challenge, if you will, to show how robust the immune system is. And Davidson did a group with 41 employees, so healthy people. It was an 8-week mindfulness meditation program again. And it was a mix of MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, i.e. John Kabat-Zinn style UMass medical program, which is basically it's kind of like an insight tradition or a Theravada, but with a lot stripped out to make it sort of almost agnostic and non-cosmological. But it's very much a mindfulness sort of awareness process that's taught in the MBSR. And it was weekly sessions for 8 weeks. And the results to that group were an antibody response to the flu vaccine that was dramatically increased. And they saw left frontal EEG activation, which this frontal asymmetry Davidson's shown in mood with long-term meditators. So there seems to be something with asymmetric activation, meaning left front, and the immune system response. They may be tied together. So positive mood, positive immune system. Kind of interesting. I think of the left front as being an approach system. I wonder if the approach system, the left front, as it lights up, brings the immune system up, because if you're going to be approaching the world, you might be exposed to more stuff and the body has to be more on guard. Just a hunch. I don't know if that's true or not. So the study that I really like, it was published in 2013, but it was done, the research was done 20 years, 30 years earlier. So one of my colleagues, Dr. Gary Schumer, who retired last year or the year before, he was in Torrance, California at the ADD Center, which still exists. It's a different owner, but if you're looking for ADD services, they're a good group. And Dr. Schumer did a study in the 80s on HIV positive men. Now, for those of you who are young or who weren't super aware in the 80s, turn this down. The diagnosis of HIV in the 80s was a death sentence, and it was killing huge communities of people. And so Dr. Schumer was looking at potentially immune modifying treatments with a group of men. It was 40 plus HIV men who were broken out into 4 groups. And the groups were given 2 different active interventions or a wait list. So one group of 10 men were a wait list. They did not receive any treatment. And then of the other 3 groups, one group received at-home cranioelectrostim, alpha stim style little pulses every day, 5 days a week. Another group received neurofeedback in the office twice a week, and it was OZ 8 to 12 reward, OZ minus A1, 8 to 12 reward. And a 4th group received both the neurofeedback and the CES. And this was done for 16 weeks, twice a week. So 32 sessions of alpha 8 to 12 hertz reward at OZA1. And that was true for both the neurofeedback only group and for the group that received neurofeedback and CES stimulation. And for those 2 groups, the CD4 plus cells, killer T cells, went up significantly in both of those groups that received neurofeedback and did not go up in the CES alone or the waitlist alone or the waitlist group. So the takeaway here is that EEG neurofeedback was shown to increase killer T cells significantly. Now, it's a small N study, and as far as I know, it's not been replicated. But it's a very robust effect. And I've seen this, as I mentioned, in individuals. And I've used this same theory to develop protocols that I've seen impact people's, I believe, their immune system and autoimmune, including allergies, including chronic autoimmune system like mast cell phenomena. This alpha type of training can impact those things positively. So we don't exactly know why, and the mechanism of how we're modifying is not super well understood. I have some ideas at the end of the talk today about how this might be working, but we still don't really know. All right, some more questions. El Chatterino, if the left front is tuned optimally and a bit turned up, all related things would be a bit more potent or upbeat. Maybe, yeah. I mean, if the left front is an approach system and it gets stronger, I think people do get more excited, excitable, more interested, more responsive to stimuli, So I'm not sure exactly for everyone, but it seems like it's possible, yeah. Ilya is asking, I saw some literature on conscientiousness of the big five being linked to left dorsolateral PFC activity. Thoughts? Yeah, conscientiousness. I'm not sure why, because that's not really a social area, but there must be something around motivation and approach systems that help you decide to do the right thing. Doing the right thing is conscientiousness, and it must be something tied in to the approach system. Maybe a lack of resistance, lack of avoidance from the right allows us to engage with approach on the left, meaning we know what's right to do, but if the left is fully engaged, then we do it. If the right's more engaged, then we don't. I mean, maybe it's that. Maybe it's indirect. Ryan's asking, how would you use those protocols in regards to someone that is sick? How soon after getting sick would you have someone do it, etc.? Pretty soon after. I've had folks, home training clients certainly, who would be like, oh, I was going to set up a session, but I just got COVID and I feel like crap, or I got a virus and I'm sick. And what we say to them effectively is, ooh, that sucks. Well, rest, take a few days off if you want, but we put an immune protocol in for you. So if you want to do an immune protocol a couple, 3 times, see if you notice feeling better. And generally people do. I usually use a PZ minus A1 eyes closed training, kind of like what I'm doing here, followed by a CZ like I'm doing here. And I have people do it 3 times. And what I find for many of them is their longer COVID exposure or the flu seems to accelerate. The course of the disease experience seems to be shortened. I'm not sure if that's just placebo or if we're actually getting, educated killer T cells being dumped into the system. But people do seem to notice a support with their immune system when doing that protocol. Radar is asking, can you train directly on the Nasian like you can do with the Indian? I mean, right here? You could. I'm not sure if I have a protocol I would use for that. I mean, there's no reason you can't. There's brain tissue right behind there. But I'd have to have a good rationale. It would have to be damaged, or maybe somebody would have to have a crush injury there. That's a pretty common place to have a crush injury in a car accident. But honestly, when I'm doing that location, the Nasian, you might as well just do HEG and just do the whole frontal lobe with a blood flow training instead of trying to target the intrahemispheric sulcus there. That's kind of a narrow area, and the EEG is changing direction all over the place. Okay, I'm still training. 20 minutes. Okay, I'm gonna. Oh, there's no timer going. I must have avoided the timer. If you hit F4, it voids the timer. So let me do that. Let me quit eager. There we go. Okay, let me take these wires off and answer more questions and talk about more science. Ilya is saying that makes so much sense. Thanks. You are welcome, sir. Happy to answer questions. So there are other papers I saw. The Gary Schumer one was really powerful. Gary published this. I was talking to him at a conference, and he really underscored this idea that it was bleak 20 years earlier doing this research on people and with people who had no real hope, no real antiretrovirals, no good drugs for reducing suffering, just really a death sentence. And so this was very exciting at the time. And I always wondered why other people didn't leap on this and run with it. And I think it was just because it didn't get published until like 2019. So it took 30 years almost to publish because, clinicians are all about doing the work, not necessarily publishing the work. And so we often take longer to get research published, even though we know what works. Let's see. VJ is asking what protocols for autoimmune. If I talked about it earlier, disregard. So for autoimmune, I would use actually PDQ is probably happy because I mentioned immune in general or immunocompromised, but autoimmune you'll find histamine, you'll find mast cells, you'll find allergies, you'll find distal skin kind of reactions, the skin being the largest tissue in the body. The largest organ in the body is the skin. But one thing you might not know about the skin is developmentally, it's very similar to the brain. Developmentally, we turn into a tube of 3 tissues, the endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. Internal, middle, and external. And the same layer of tissue then differentiates into both the brain and the skin. Another layer into the skeletal muscles and all those things, and then another layer into everything else. So the same layer turns into the skin and the brain. This is why we have a lot of the same cell-based responses. You can see lipofuscin or fuscin, that's sort of, yellowing of age spots in the skin. The same thing happens in brain cells. So a lot of overlapping phenomena, including some of the histaminic things, the allergy things. So the brain uses histamine as a neurotransmitter. The body in the skin especially has mast cells doing immune modifying and sort of like sitting and working on filtering out dangerous molecules. So the short answer is that the same protocols would be used for autoimmune as would be used for immune, but you might need to tamp things down more. You might need to look at fast beta. And so in someone with allergies or other autoimmune phenomena, same thing, beta rewards, SMR rewards. However, you need to look for beta spindles because somebody with a really hot system that's reactive is going to have these little bursting spindles probably somewhere. And if you can find where the beta spindles are in the parietal area, the central areas, and what frequency range they're in and narrowly target with an inhibit, you're likely to reduce the systems being reactive. So I've never seen it in my clients, but I've had colleagues claim that they can reliably eliminate allergies using neurofeedback. When I dig into what they're doing, it's very traditional stuff. It's alpha and SMR training. So I don't know if it'll happen to you, but you could potentially, pursue changes in autoimmune or allergic response with alpha rewards and SMR rewards. Ryan is asking, how many sessions of neurofeedback do you think you've done total in your life? Do you still get noticeable benefits and plan on training forever? Yeah, I'm sitting here slightly bumbling my words because I trained my alpha too slow for the first few minutes. I definitely still notice effects. I definitely get effects that are therapeutic. The past several weeks, I've done a little bit of HEG each week because I've been fighting off some migraines. And, every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I was noticing migraine stuff creep in. I would just do some HEG on Monday night with you guys. And then all the rest of the week, no migraines. And then it would creep back in toward the weekend. I think it might be seasonal allergies for me that are causing migraines with the pollen changes here in the spring. But I was able to, a few weeks in a row, really squash a migrainous process. And that's as needed for me. What I don't really do is courses of training. I don't really have a goal that I'm trying to accomplish. And therefore, I'm going to do a dozen sessions in a few weeks, or I'm going to iterate in a certain direction. Those of you who train with Peak Brain know that a lot of what we do is iterate through protocols. And sometimes there's a method to that where we're pushing in a certain direction, trying to create foundational changes and then larger changes and then larger changes. Other times we're just finding the protocol classes that are goal congruent for you, that are dialed in for you, and then cycling through the goals. And both things will work pretty reliably. But for myself, I'm mostly doing spot neurofeedback here and there, trying something every so often that's new. If I'm in the office and I'm bored or I have extra time, I might do a session of SMR training. I really respond well to the basics and strongly. So for me, doing a couple of SMR sessions means I'm going to get days of noticeable effect. I've also been training my brain off and on for 25 years. And so total number of sessions is probably not that high. I've probably done a few hundred, maybe 400 or 500 sessions total, but I have clients who've done that in the past 2 years. So I've done a bunch, but not as much as some of our expert clients. So let me talk about some of these other immune-based papers we dug up. So Young et al. In 2018 did a paper on fMRI neurofeedback and depression. And so this is real-time fMRI. What you do is you image the amygdala, typically the left or the right. In this case, they use the left. And these were, I'm not sure if this particular study replicated the McLean MRI, but the initial fMRI work for biofeedback ties the bold response, the blood oxygen level dependent, the surge of blood and metabolism that you can measure with fMRI. It ties that to a image of a flame, and the flame gets bigger when the activation of the amygdala, I believe, in the left goes up. The idea is that it's positive emotion producing left amygdalar activation. And so they did a few of these protocols, and it wasn't Young, I don't believe, it was somebody else before that. I was actually at McLean when this was discovered, or I believe, and a researcher, I was working for Mike Henry, who's the head of the ECT program, and he's a psychiatrist, does a lot of work with depression. And we were looking at the brains of people that were discontinuing from medication, from antidepressants. At the same time, I was observing some ECT work on depression in people. And there was another lab nearby, or research center, that was doing MRI imaging. Some of that was with the same patients, because we were trying to look at the structural changes that happen with medication changes, because there are actually some structural changes in the caudate, especially in some other dopaminergic areas. So it was really interesting stuff. And we're looking at the structure, and a few people with very severe depression who had gone off their meds as part of what they wanted to do for the study would go into the scanner, the MRI machine, and would get scanned to look at the frontal tissue structures, and would come out of the scanner happy. And would be like, oh, I'm so glad I signed up for this study. That was the best treatment. I feel so good. And the researchers are like, that was an MRI. We didn't do anything. But it turns out the activation of the energy in those areas seemed to do something. So somebody then built this little flame visualizer that when the amygdala activity in the left goes up, the flame gets bigger, or in the right goes down, same thing. And so this group did use that protocol, and they did multiple sessions. It works faster, but not quite as reliably, fMRI biofeedback. So it was several sessions targeting these positive emotion circuits in theory. And they had 3 impacts in the group that could do this. A better, the people that had better neurofeedback performance, i.e. able to make the change in the stimulus, had lower TNF alpha, which is an immune modifier. Also with better neurofeedback performance, you saw a correlation with lower CCL2, which I believe is an inflammatory marker. And then there was changes in the kynurenine pathway, which I believe is involved with elimination of inflammatory byproducts. I could be wrong on that last one. I forgot to look it up. So the takeaway is brain training here succeeds in impacting the immune system, and the ability to make the change in the brain activity predicts the amount or predicts the ability to make the change in the immune system. So that's a pretty big deal. There seems to be something happening, not just in mindfulness, not just in EEG neurofeedback, but also in blood flow training, which is fMRI neurofeedback. PNQ asks a question: what is the neurofeedback research landscape right now? Right now, it's really poor. No one owns neurofeedback, so no one's paying money for the research. None of the research that's out there and published is done like it's done in the clinics. You know, all the really good neurofeedback is done in an individualized, iterative way. None of the literature does that. They always use small n's or small groups. Often not blinded, often one protocol, often the same for everyone. And the effects are still there, but they're weak. So that's the state of it. You know, the stuff we're doing in the clinics, I would conservatively estimate runs 2 to 3 decades ahead of what shows up in the literature. So we've known, for instance, about this immune thing for 20, 30 years. Gary published it in 2019, you know, not that long ago. Radar Ashwood's asking, what's the difference between slow cortical potential training and infralow or infraslow training? I don't know. They're all below 1 hertz. Slow cortical potential is more voluntary, where you practice concentrating and changing the SCP. The SCP is basically the DC drift of the whole brain, and the IFL, ISL is a faster frequency. The theory is that deep subcortical structures, including the brainstem, run in infra-low frequencies and not in oscillatory EEG frequencies. And by manipulating those, you get deeper effects on the temporal lobes and on the brainstem. But I don't know how much of that's true and just hand-waving theory. So I think the people to ask about IFL and ISL and SCP would be the people that invented and teach them as much as you can. So SCP, Niels Bierbaumer, probably in Tübingen still, but he might be in the UK these days. I forget where he is. I always get them confused, but Mark Smith is a proponent behind IFL, and of course the Othmer's behind the other one. Sue Othmer did die a couple years ago, but you can get trained by the EEG Institute on this sort of Othmer method using Signet software. So I don't really know, and I think you'd have to go to one of those groups to get a really good breakdown of the difference. And my hunch is those three groups all have particular perspective on each other's training in that sub-hertz range. So I don't know that it's well understood. I think that the sub-hertz training is as well understood and as well practiced as traditional phenotype training was 30 years ago. Whereas a lot of gifted individuals doing great work, but it's not exactly replicable. And I think you can get big side effects in infra-low and infra-slow, especially because I see people all the time that get side effects, increased anxiety, and they're doing infra-slow or infra-low for anxiety. So I don't love that technique in general because I don't think it's as well understood, but I do know people that use it quite successfully and get great results with their clients. All right, other questions? PNQ's asking, some body workers claim to help out with allergies, which is super interesting too. Yeah, I'm not sure why, but I've heard that. El Chatarino's asking, an MRI was noted to also trigger this on accident? Yes. Yes, people climbed into MRI machines while doing imaging for structures and looking at these sort of amygdalar adjacent areas and came out with a mood lift. Yeah. So that was how we discovered. I mean, so much neurofeedback we discovered by mistake. There's another one. Yeah, Mark Smith is usually responsive on Facebook. Absolutely. So you can go to Facebook and ask Mark about it, and he'll give you lots of his opinion. Do know that every provider that does their own thing is very opinionated. So after you listen to Mark's opinion, go and listen to Siegfried Author's opinion, go and listen to Niels Bierbaumer's opinion, and then kind of like develop your own opinion if you can. VJ is saying that SCP keeps on interesting me. There's nothing there for you, VJ, as far as I know. I mean, it's more like doing biofeedback. I think you're getting the same effects off of SCP as you might get off of HRV or meditation. That's my hunch. You're probably doing things that are eclipsing the effects you would get out of the SCP. VJ is asking, Peak ever offer SCP, or is that simply not a thing through Eager? There is a sub-hertz module that is recently developed in Eager that can be enabled, but I only do protocols that I know reasons for. Like even within the traditional landscape, you know, you asked me today about 2 protocols and I was like, yeah, you could use that. You could try it. And you're like, oh, I'm experimenting. And kinda, because I don't use that C3 minus C4 you asked about earlier today. I mean, I certainly do with some people, and I have all kinds of protocols I have used, but I often have to have a good rationale in someone's brain, in their QEEG, in my clinical lore, in my approach, and I just don't have a good overlap there for SCP. I don't know a use case that it would serve that I can't serve with tools I know how to use better. So that's really my takeaway on that. Radar is asking, what would I train to improve ability to do navigation and make mental maps? It's probably going to be C3. As well as areas just behind C3 and C4. So like CP3 and CP4 are likely. T6. So C3 minus A1, T5 minus T6, and maybe look at the EEG, but maybe CP3 A1 or CP4 A2 will probably have big blobs of delta or theta if the person has no ability to mentally navigate. I've seen that before, and you can generally train it. PNQ is asking, how do we navigate the contradicting things neurofeedback practitioners say? Like, this is hard. Yeah, it's kind of hard. The short answer is you have to get good at sniffing the Kool-Aid. You have to get good at understanding if someone's explaining something because they're parroting marketing language or because they are actually explaining something. One of the really primary roles of a neurofeedback provider for you should be to make you an expert. That's my firm belief. You should be working with somebody who can sit down over your QEEG and teach you to look at it. You should be working with somebody who can explore protocol development with you and make you an active participant in how you work on your brain. So that means that you don't really have to select from the technology, it doesn't really matter. A good provider can use any technology, really. What you have to do is select a provider for the same sort of criteria you would select for a therapist. They listen, they're giving you the agency and you the sort of ability to drive the process. They have time for you. They have enough ability to care about what you're experiencing. And then lastly, I would say somebody who's worked with the things you want to work on. If you have a lot of trauma response stuff you want to work on, don't go to somebody who only does seizure work or only does ADHD. Go to a trauma-informed therapist who happens to use neurofeedback. And so that's the real rub for picking somebody. The providers are often less informed. And remember that most providers are not very educated in neurofeedback. Most providers are therapists, psychologists or LCSWs or masters of social work or whatever, master counselors. And then they do a 3 or 4 day workshop in neurofeedback. And then they maybe get certified. And now they spend a year learning from somebody else. And often, even after a year of doing that, they can't really look at a brain map and make protocols that are going to match somebody's needs. Other providers learn the brain first. And then they go into any software package, any neurofeedback, and they learn a brain and they can make the brain dance based on whatever the software package can do best. So what I'm hinting at is if you're going to try to become a neurofeedback provider or get very, very deep into this, learning to read brain maps and your own brain map especially is key. Learning to sort of swallow the marketing language of a particular software vendor is really not that important. And again, get good at sniffing if someone's trying to sell you something, because it's really obvious. I mean, when people start using language like optimizing the brain and balancing the brain and, the brain's optimal state, and when there's language like, we don't actually do anything, we just hold a mirror up, that's all nonsense, Like it's not that hard to squint and go, wait a minute, that software provider is full of it. They're always obfuscating what they're talking about. It's not actually real. It's all fluffy language. And you can tell in the field what's like that. Also, if something does too much, that's a good sign that it's a scam. So there's a software out there called Quantum Biofeedback, which used to be called the Rife Machine, also called SCIO. Utter charlatanry or quackery. Horrible, horrible stuff. And it's used to diagnose by bioelectric impedance and give you like thousands and thousands of possible diagnoses off of an assessment, quote unquote. It's utter bunkery and it should be stayed away from. And unfortunately, it has the word biofeedback on the tin, even though it's not biofeedback. So you can tell with a little bit of digging if you're working with quack software or if you're working with an individual who believes the hype, if they're not a critical thinker. So make sure your provider is a critical thinker. Don't assume they're an expert. Assume that their job is to make you an expert and see how good they are at it while they're listening deeply to you and while they're encouraging you that they've dealt with the stuff you want to deal with. That's really how you find a good provider. It's not about which software, hardware is best, because you can do good work with any of the systems. Let's see. PNQ is saying, do I think I'm more right than other practitioners? You do have different takes than the Jay Gunkelman crowd. No, I don't. Absolutely don't. People keep saying that, but I'm trained exactly the same way as those people are in the actual EEG. I do not have a different perspective. I'm a more experienced clinician than most of them. I've been doing neurofeedback for longer than most of those clinicians. And when I'm saying things that I've experienced in my clinical work, this is what I'm sharing with you. But All of those people who are trained by that group, I don't think any of them are cognitive neuroscientists who have a PhD in EEG. I don't think any of them have done neurofeedback for 25 or 30 years. So yes, there's some interesting stuff, but we have to remember that the map is not the territory, the brain map is not the brain, and just because you prefer one piece of software to do your analysis doesn't really matter. The only real difference between the folks who are trained by Jay is that they spend more time doing work in Win EEG and more time with the raw signals, and they don't like the other database, the big commercial database called NeuroGuide. I really prefer. And it's because it lets me read the maps really well. And Jay's group poo-poos the idea of reading maps a little bit. I think you should do both. The maps and the raw EEG are necessary. So I would argue that I actually eclipse the work they do. I have all the training they have in terms of reading raw, and then some. Because and on top of that, I have much more clinical experience than most of those people. So I'm not more right. My answers are more nuanced generally, and often do agree with what Jay would say. I think I skipped one here. VJ says he's seen Delta rise up with disease. Yeah. Would I be willing to talk a bit more about Delta and the use case to train it? You generally don't want to train Delta. It's very rare to train Delta itself. It just is a sign that the brain's in this sort of inflammatory, sluggish, high amplitude, slow brainwave state. And that's really not a state you need to train away. Train the brain will heal and rest, the Delta will go away. Now, that might be, there might be caveats to that. Like you might want to train the Delta down if you have big surges of it that you can't break up. You might want to train Delta down if you're doing alpha theta and you want to inhibit Delta to make sure someone is less likely to fall asleep during it. But there really are no use cases where you would reward Delta, VJ. Years ago, I've never done it, but one of my mentors did it. And we created a seizure really easily in somebody who was seizure prone because you're rewarding Delta. You're rewarding the range within which seizures happen. So I don't think it's a good idea ever to reward below about 3 hertz, is the short answer. Radar is now saying inhibiting 0 to 3 helps people tolerate SMR. Well, not SMR, helps them tolerate alpha theta, because then they aren't going to fall asleep during alpha theta. You can tolerate, maybe I said this at CZ. Some people, this is an old Seaburn Fisher, I believe, or maybe it's Ruth Lanius idea, that there may be abreactions to SMR at CZ in people with developmental trauma history. And one of the ways in which these people's brains may be dysregulated is with excess 2 and 3 hertz at CZ. And so whoever this provider was had a habit of inhibiting 0 to 3 at CZ when there was trauma history, and found that they were less likely to create abreactions by doing SMR at CZ. So that's the SMR I think you might be remembering. I only really use 0 to 3 when I'm doing like a POZ or OZ alpha theta with a delta inhibit, because the person is so deeply tired, but they probably still need some alpha theta for some reason. So I want to try to hedge and do alpha theta, but keep them awake. Hey, Leo, how's it going, sir? What about AIs? Can AIs read brain mapping QEEG and write a protocol? LOL. The short answer is no. You have to the short answer is if you plug a QEEG into a chat GPT, even a good one, what you'll get back is about 80% of stuff that is right, and about 20% stuff that looks really right and is wrong, completely and utterly wrong. Some of that's because the machine doesn't understand things properly and makes mistakes. Some of it is because it assumes artifact is real pretty easily. Then we have people like El Chatarino here, who's actually built some software to do sort of train analysis. And I believe the analyses, I assume you're doing something similar, Chad, as what Lisa Tatarin's doing with her group, where you're getting actually some pretty sophisticated analysis out of the tool set. And someone like me or this more skilled people on this channel can probably use that and get something out of it. But, I'm reminded, I have a couple clients who come to me and said, hey, I just put the QEEG in a chat GPT and chat GPT says we should be working on this and we should be working on that. And why, and what's this thing over here that means I have this problem. And like 2 of those things were artifact. And one of those things was contraindicated because the person wanted to raise their alpha speed and already super anxious. And I'm like, well, we can, but there's an order of operations here. We have to do this first and then this to avoid creating problems. So like it was some good information, you know, a gem, a nugget kind of nested in a big pile of mud. And the client who wasn't skilled at reading EEGs couldn't tell that the ChatGPT wasn't valid. So that's where the risk is. Now, do I think that's going away in the next couple of years? Yeah, I think in a year or 2, you'll be able to feed your QEEG in a ChatGPT or whatever, or specialized tools, and you won't need as much skill from someone like me in the mix. Absolutely. But I don't think we're there yet. I think we're still a couple of years away. El Chatarino saying, LOL, people have been saying that about you. Yeah, I know. On Reddit, people telling me that Dr. Hill, you know, you should work with someone who actually reads EEG. What do you think I do? I of course read EEG. I don't teach every person to read EEG because it's really subtle. You know who else doesn't teach people to read their EEG? Patients? Jay. Jay doesn't sit down with a patient and show them how to read raw EEG. He does that as a mentoring. Chad saying, I seem more in line with Gunkelman than most out there. I thought you came from his camp. Yeah, I kind of did. I was trained in EEG by a few people on the East Coast by Dr. Larry Hirschberg. I actually got trained in all the brain trainer stuff by Pete Van Dusen. When I came out to the West Coast and got my PhD studying neurofeedback and EEG, I worked in the QEEG landscape with Jack Johnstone, who was the owner of Qmetrics. And Qmetrics was a company that Jay and Jack owned together. And right around that time, Jay moved from California, I think, up to Northern California and had a company called BSI, Brain Science International. And that was sort of the start of that consulting group that was using WinEEG to educate. And so Qmetrics and BSI kind of became 2 versions of a different, of the same business, doing analysis and consulting on EEG. And I stayed, here in California. I was mentored by Jack Johnstone. I did a lot of work with him on EEG. I did a lot of work on building research studies. Jack and I were working on grants with Takeda, California Studies, drug companies, looking at the very, very late in the testing, the safety profiles of long-term administration of schizophrenia drugs. So I built a whole bunch of ERPs and long-term EEG monitoring studies, and we were doing repetitive EEGs on schizophrenics in Glendale, looking at these changes in the ERPs and the ongoing EEG in response to being on the medication for days. And so I wasn't mentored directly by Jay, but I got to say that every single conversation I've ever had with Jay, he tends to give me kudos. And I think he gives me a lot of respect for being trained in the field fairly well, in spite of having not done the BCIA or, Jay's program. So I don't know. I think the only people poo-pooing my contribution or my skill set are folks that don't have any idea about my role in the field. Let's see. Radar has seen ChatGPT completely make up protocols. Yeah, fake protocols. Exactly. Yeah, I know. And, just like you don't want to do random things off your own QEEGs just because they're outliers, you don't necessarily want to pick some random protocol off of ChatGPT. Hey, Sonia. Would doing neurofeedback 5 days a week, each session lasting 10 minutes, be effective to train an ASD brain to get off of seizure? Probably. You can definitely ease into from shorter sessions up to longer ones. And you would want to do SMR training targeted to wherever the kindling focus is, if you can. Like if the kindling focus is on the SMR strip, that's easy. But if it's someplace else, let's say it's a temporal lobe, like a T6 resident seizure, you might have to do like a CZ minus T6 SMR, but it should work and you should be able to do 10 minutes. Now, 5 days in a row might not be ideal. I don't know. It would depend on a lot of other factors, and people with ASD stuff, they tend to have a lot of like over arousal of the nervous system. And so they might not tolerate 5 days in a row. You might be better off doing 12 to 15 minutes every other day, or 2 days in a row, 1 day off. That's usually a slightly better way to go. That's the previous question. El Chatarino, ChatGPT works, but had not used it without oversight. Yeah, exactly. It's a great tool if you already know what to do. It saves you time because then you scan through and say, oh, that's wrong. This is right. This is right. This is right. This is right. Okay, cool. And that's a great way to use ChatGPT or any AI. But yeah, right now it's still too much of an art to be done well, and the training data isn't there. Like ChatGPT in its LLM form and in its reasoning form are so good because they have vast amounts of data on which to learn and train. And so one thing we should remember about these LLMs and these reasoning models is they don't keep learning once they're published. We're about to start getting models that can update their knowledge and can continue to update and develop more and more permanent context, so to speak, as they grow and learn. That's not there yet, though. Those are not out yet in the wild. Right now, when a model is released, it's released with a certain cutoff date before which all of its logic and data and thinking is based on. And there's just not enough out there to give those tools the skill that someone like Jay has, or maybe even me. I'm not as good as Jay at reading the raw. I will agree in that. But I'm better than most people who've not studied EEG, and I'm still better than ChatGPT at looking even at QEEG pictures, a lot better. So don't be suckered by ChatGPT yet. Give it a year. That's my estimation. Radar's agreeing ChatGPT makes a lot of claims which turn out to be fake. Yeah, there's still a pretty high hallucination rate, and it comes and goes. Like, I was getting really impressed with ChatGPT doing sort of conversational research, and then the recent version of it updated a couple of days ago. Now every third or fourth thing that it's saying to me, I'm like, that's not right. That's an error. And so I think that it also isn't consistent. I do a lot of vibe coding or using ChatGPT to write software. And as this vibe coding has gotten up in the marketplace and people have been doing more of it, there's sort of a perspective on it where vibe coding isn't like the magic machine, the magic genie in the box who builds things for you. Vibe coding is like you have a junior engineer who's a little drunk and needs to be kind of like told what to do and then like kept on task. And if you think of your AI being like a neurofeedback technician who's a little inexperienced, who's a little enthusiastic, who thinks they know more than they do, and is likely to make mistakes, then you're actually getting a pretty good one of those. A good junior coach who's read a lot and is like putting ideas together, but those ideas are not always congruent. They're not always yet internally consistent. So watch out for ChatGPT when using it to analyze brain data still. El Chatarino's pointing out you have to know how to talk to it in clinical and text speak. Yep. And in AI speak. Yep. El Chatarino is saying ERPs with meds must have a lot of interesting patterns through regions. It does, yeah. You can see changes in the P300 in schizophrenia meds. I was looking at changes in the P50 as one of my experiments with this group, where the P50 is a 50 millisecond positive going waveform that happens after you hear a sudden noise or a bit of jarring information, like little static. The brain reacts. And in somebody who is typically developed or has a typical brain, you'll see a P50 show up 50 milliseconds after a burst of static. And if you play two bursts of static back to back, the second one doesn't produce a P50. There's a habituation, an attenuation, meaning once you hear a loud sound once or a weird sound once, the brain's able to not react to it. So the P50 is really a sensory gating, and it's also involved in the startle response. And in schizophrenics, classically, you go tss, tss, with the burst of static, and you get two P50s. You don't get sort of sensory suppression of extraneous information the same way. These medications that Takeda developed did produce an abolishing of the second P50. So interesting stuff, but you can go look at the drug studies by Takeda to see some of that research. Jay Glanton, hello Jay, hello sir, is asking, what are your thoughts of ChatGPT analysis of the IVA 2? That might be better because a couple things. One is CPTs are better understood in the brain. Two, they have better face validity. The constructs are valid. 3, you'd be able to grab the long manual, the 40-page manual for the IVA, or the 2 research articles that talk about the IVA, because the IVA is an open spec, actually. It's not just the brain train version. So you'd be able to grab a whole bunch of literature about CPTs and all the constructs in the IVA 2 and use those as training data, and then use ChatGPT to write a report. That would probably be a lot closer to valid than having it believe noisy human data in pictures. In general, humans can deal with the IVA 2 or CPTs in general a lot more easily as well. So ChatGPT should be able to do that. Sonia's saying, thank you. You're welcome, Sonia. My pleasure, of course. Leo's saying, are specific neurofeedback protocols like SMR or alpha theta known to influence GABA or dopamine levels? And how strong is the link between brainwave change and neurotransmitter activity? So there's really 2 answers here. One is the actual what is understood and known discreetly and perfectly, and very, very little, because you can't test neurotransmitter levels in a human brain. Not when it's alive anyways. And the downstream metabolites that you pee out or in the CSF may not have any real correlation with the levels of active neurotransmitters. And it's more about the density of neurotransmitter receptors than it is about the level of a neurotransmitter anyways. But we know that we're affecting both dopamine and GABA in neurofeedback. The dopamine we know, for instance, if you do beta SMR training and you're on psychostimulants, starting about 3 to 5 weeks into neurofeedback, you can't take the same dose of stimulants. They act twice as strong, 3 times as strong, 4 times as strong. And what's happening there is a sensitization of dopamine. It must be, given the mechanism. It happens with the dopaminergic class of stimulants. And then GABA, we have sort of the opposite, where neurofeedback can re-educate a damaged GABA system. The classic example is somebody who drinks routinely every day. Their GABA starts to climb tonically, and we pass out. But the brain doesn't want the GABA to be that high. It's kind of like blood pH. Everything's kind of really tightly regulated, and the GABA glutamate balance is tightly regulated. So if the GABA is being elevated chronically by alcohol, the brain responds by raising glutamate tonically or chronically. And so what you end up with is high GABA and high glutamate if you're an active drinker routinely, a chronic drinker. And then when you withdraw the alcohol, you're left shaky and nervous and can't fall asleep, and you're having seizures and you can't relax. And that doesn't usually go away if you've been drinking for a couple of years. You're left in that hyper-aroused state with no GABA tone in your system. You're all glutamate. And you can see huge signatures in the EEG, tons of beta, tons of hypercoherent beta. And what happens is people cannot downregulate, lack of GABAergic tone. Doing alpha theta with SMR, you will see a very, very reliable re-education of that person's ability to relax at will, to fall asleep at will, to calm down. That is GABAergic tone being reasserted. So while the links are indirect, you can tell that it's happening. So I hope that answered your question, Leo. Sonia's asking, could neurofeedback be a game changer when it comes to LD, learning disabilities, especially in kids, or are those stories not credible at all? No, there's a lot that can be done with LD. Pure dyslexia, I think, is hard to move in neurofeedback. But I work with nonverbal learning issues. I work with stuttering. I work with difficulty reading. A lot of that's speed of processing. Some of that's timing. Some of that's fatigue. Some of it's attention. So no, I routinely get large changes in people that are diagnosed as learning disability. But if it's a true language impairment that's strong, that's about the least moving phenomena. Like someone who has no language and who's autistic, it's rarely changed. Someone who has minimal language who's autistic, it will change. Someone who's like producing a few words, the words start exploding when you do neurofeedback, especially if they're young. But you aren't going to get somebody who's nonverbal to become verbal generally in neurofeedback. I've seen it happen twice, and I've worked with thousands and thousands of people in the spectrum who were nonverbal. So people that are minimally verbal or who have issues in their verbal production, like lack prosody and talk like this all the time, you can work on those phenomena pretty reliably. But speech production is a very difficult one to get around. If somebody has receptive language, you can also usually improve that as well. So there are movements in those phenomena, but they're not as well understood as the big ones that move more easily, like attention, stress, and sleep. Jay saying, awesome, thank you, you're welcome. Chat GPT analyzed IVA 2 and told you that you were smart, so you wanted to believe it was real. I might have told you the same thing. You can think back. VJ is asking, that protocol helped a ton. Which protocol, VJ, that you did that helped a ton? Remind us. Tell us which protocol you enjoyed, VJ. Radar Askwith is asking, there might be an inflammation component to dyslexia. There might be, because high alpha that's stuck and doesn't phase properly with language loading shows up in some flavors of dyslexia. And theoretically, that could be an inflammatory response, but I don't know if that's really true. I think it's just still a possibility. We don't have the mechanism to test that. Hey, Casey Jane, nice to see you. Thanks for stopping by. VJ is saying SMR and alpha theta. Yeah, it's a really nice hybrid, isn't it? When you mix alpha theta training with SMR training. And you and I have done a lot of very interesting variants of those two. And VJ, if you want to testify for a second, is it true? Would it be accurate to say that different variants of SMR and alpha, when they're combined, can feel completely different based on what you do, even though the protocols aren't that different necessarily? Is that a valid statement? You can let me know what you think of that. VJ's adding many dual alpha theta deep were the biggest shifts, especially dual. Yeah, we have a protocol we use called dual, which is frontal 2-channel training and then central 2-channel training, or central and then alpha theta. So we've been doing some really interesting protocols with VJ that are really deep. Yeah, VJ's agreeing they feel completely different. So similar sets of alpha theta and SMR, when combined differently, can produce really different effects. Differences in sight, differences in what you're combining it with. You get different effects later on that day. It's very bizarre. It is very bizarre, right? How how different, we do an alpha theta sweep that contains an alpha theta you've done before, but because it's mixed with a sweep, meaning multiple regions that are tied together, it feels completely different. It's because other parts of your brain are being involved. That's what's happening. Sonia's saying, what about processing speed in kids? Could neurofeedback help increase it significantly? It can. Yeah, you'll see the alpha speed, the peak alpha frequency. Eyes closed, linked ears, montage, left hemisphere, front left speeds of alpha, and then also PZ, back midline alpha. Those will correlate pretty strongly with the experienced speed of processing, which tracks with language access, verbal fluency, and IQ really strongly. So you'll often see somebody who has cognitive issues in a kid who has an alpha speed that's running 1, 2, 3, 4 standard deviations lower than average. And generally you can change that. Generally, neurofeedback makes about 1 standard deviation of change every 25 sessions or so. And that is true in my experience with a population of extremely slowed alpha, which happens sometimes in a developmentally atypical population, especially, CP, autism, brain injuries, that kind of stuff. Leandro's asking, neurofeedback can shift the brain from inflammation. One would think so, yes. We never, there's some studies that I talked about earlier today in this little talk that show some changes in inflammatory markers with neurofeedback. So yes, a couple more to talk about here before we finish today. There was a group, Petrowski et al. In 2023 did a study on HRV and biofeedback, looking at 55 people with panic disorder, and they did an RCT with a sham control, sham control HRV, and a 4-week breathing protocol. And they found TNF alpha levels, which is an inflammatory marker, dropped by an effect size of 0.077, p-value less than 0.05, right on the edge of significant. But they also saw more of an effect in improvement subjectively in the active versus the sham, and they saw the vagus nerve change in its function. So one of the theories is that we're tapping into the vagus nerve, which of course leaves the brain directly, and that's how we're able to get into some of these features. Radar is asking, does fast alpha cause increased processing speed because it's correlated with high norepinephrine? I mean, I'm not sure why. It's just alpha is the idling speed of the brain, so it correlates with high processing speed because it's running fast. And alpha's, if you have an old automatic car and the idle's turned way up and you lift your foot off the gas, the car surges off the mark. But if the idle's very slow and you lift your foot off the brake, rather, the car leaves the starting line very slowly. That's what it's up. So if your alpha is really, really quick, you can hand off information between parts of your brain really rapidly. Now, PNQ is asking, can alpha speed be too fast? And the answer is yes. If your alpha is running faster than where you really want it to be, you'll feel rushed. You'll feel anxious significantly. So you want your alpha to be where it's sweet for you and feels good. You don't want to just go for a faster alpha necessarily. More important than the raw speed is the synchronization of the alpha speeds within one hemisphere. So looking at your QEEGs, look at the left hemisphere and make sure the alpha is staying within roughly the same range in most of the hemisphere. And that'll be a sign that it's functional. If it's slow, maybe it's tiredness or fatigue or developmental stuff. But if it's spread out, now it means the brain's going to have a really hard time handing information back and forth between parts of that left hemisphere. Thanks again, doctor. Of course, Sonia, you're welcome. God bless you too. Leo's asking, am I sure I'm not an AI yourself? Were I born that way or acquired from training? I mean, Leo, had you met me like 25 years ago, you would just think I was the world's like most ADHD person you've ever met. Just super high energy, never stop talking or moving. And I still have some of that, but like it's way tamped down because I would hang out after hours at the neurofeedback center I worked at and would do random neurofeedback to my brain until I started to get effects on ADHD. And I managed to ramp it down really significantly in my mid-20s so that I was able to go back to grad school, learn all this stuff to teach you guys. So neurofeedback is the reason I got my PhD and the reason I'm able to do this stuff. So I think that this sounds so good it could be an AI. Gosh, the world we live in now. VJ saying I'm a cyborg, can confirm. Okay, El Chatterino saying, dude, done some serious reading and hands-on. Yeah, that's what it is. I'm just old. That's what I know most of you guys. I know most of you who are talking actively right now, you're all younger than I am. Pretty much. And this is what happens when you get old. You do 25 years of doing something, you learn a thing or two. And if you get a PhD learning it, they make you learn something as well. All right, one more study, Hinsa et al. In 2024, last year, there was a group that was doing sham astronaut training. So this is a group where they do essentially you're living in like the Arizona desert and you're isolated the same way you would be isolated for a trip to Mars. And so it's looking at stress response in the body over long periods of time of isolation and trying to figure out what the effects are on the immune system. So this group did 40, they're called analog astronauts when they're sort of mimicking the astronaut environment. They did 2 weeks of isolation. They did daily EEG sessions during their missions. And they did EEG tasks with feedback on their performance. And the results in general were a trend in the neurofeedback train group for lower C-reactive protein, but it was not a significant effect. It was there, it was pretty clearly visible on the graphs, but right on the edge of significance. However, the group by time was significant. So if you just looked at CRP itself, not significant. But the amount of CRP as a function of how many days you were in isolation compared to with and without neurofeedback, that was significant. So it was not a main effect of neurofeedback by CRP. There was sort of a secondary effect of neurofeedback by time by CRP. So it was there, but it had to be like kind of buried into the process of doing the training. We also saw a couple of metadata studies. There was one in 2014 looking at the mind-body analysis, Tai Chi, meditation, yoga, and the immune system. And they found an effect size for 0.58 for CRP reduction. And their theory was that it was a cholinergic mechanism that was causing reduction, which is kind of interesting, right? Because we think of choline as being more activating, and this was a cholinergic mechanism for reducing stress, apparently. Then Shields et al. In 2020 did a psychosocial intervention study looking at 56 trials with over 4,000 participants, and the effects of reduced stress persisted for more than 6 months after psychosocial intervention, CBT, et cetera. And the CBT groups in those studies had the lowest drop in inflammatory cytokines. So you can do therapy and meditation and yoga and neurofeedback and get changes here. Leo saying, give Dr. Hill a like. Yeah, give me a like, please. Thanks for taking your time to teach. Of course, my pleasure. And you as well, Leo. So what works best? Here's some takeaways. HRV works better than EEG across a bunch of different studies, but the EEG neurofeedback seems to have very targeted effects on CD4 plus cells in HIV positive populations. So if you're trying to hack an HIV positive body, yours or someone else's, doing Gary Schumer's protocols, alpha training at OZ-A1 seems to really do something. So, be sophisticated, do more neurofeedback tailored to the person, but include that protocol. The mechanism of that, we don't know. I think it's the relaxation response. I think it's more of an acute effect. And unlike most things in neurofeedback, then it won't be permanent. It'll be a transient support for the immune system getting some boost. So what are the mechanisms here? Well, one, the vagus nerve and the cholinergic pathway that I mentioned, where HRV changes the vagus, which impacts acetylcholine and drops inflammation. Another mechanism is the full HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And that's where neurofeedback drops stress. Dropping stress reduces cortisol. Reducing cortisol allows the immune system to recover and come back up. And then there's a third potential mechanism outlined here. With Davidson's work showing a left front activation, it sort of begs the question, is left front activation a function of the training that made them more positive, or is left front activation that showed up driving the immune response? And do you need left front activation to have that kind of immune response? That's possible. So the issues with this research is that the sample sizes are under 20 usually. Blinding's been really difficult in most of these studies. When they were blinded, people only had a 50% guess rate, so that's good. But most of these studies were not well blinded. The protocols were different across different groups and studies, and there was publication bias, sort of showing up in these little studies, working on populations of convenience or a particular, testing a particular commercial stress response product. So the big takeaway is this stuff is useful, and if you're experimenting on yourself or you're a clinician, it may be worth doing, but it's not really true that we have protocols to reliably work on immune system. We just have protocols that seem to impact it. And so it becomes more of an individualized work more broadly and might fit into a larger picture of something you're doing. And that really is because individual differences matter. So I put all the references to the studies in the show notes today. You can go down and look at those and go read all the studies if you're curious. Please feel free to come back and ask questions in the longer term chat here in the comments for the show, and I'll come back and answer them if you have any questions on those papers. We have been running long tonight. We were going to almost an hour and a half, maybe one of our longest Neurofeedback and Chill. You guys have been a great group tonight. Thanks so much for all your attention and support. I really appreciate people to talk to. That's cool. And I love teaching this stuff. I'm going to end here tonight unless you have some last minute questions. And I'll be back in a week, next Monday, 6 p.m. Pacific, or you can watch these things later if you're so inclined. Please do me a favor and find another video to like and make a comment on. Maybe share a video on another social media platform so other people can see it. The YouTube algorithm really loves that. Either way, folks, take good care of those brains until I talk to you again, and I will see you in a